Hello, I'm Heather Nani, and tonight we're talking about Shirley Jackson's short story, The Summer People. If you enjoy this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you haven't read The Summer People, I would suggest that you do so before you watch this video because I'm going to give it all away. Okay, so let's start by talking about Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is a famous American horror gothic writer. She was born in 1916. She passed away in 1965, I believe. She is best known for The Haunting of Hill House and The Lottery. Jackson was born in San Francisco and grew up in, I think it was Burlingame, California, to a wealthier family of the country club set. Jackson's mother never really approved of Shirley because, well, for a number of reasons. Shirley seemed a bit weird to her mother. She struggled with her weight. She had problems with her hair, maintaining it. She was a different kind of kid. She enjoyed writing and kept a bit to herself. Now, her older brother, who was said to be the favored, or younger brother, her brother, said to be the favored child, had once said something along the lines of Geraldine, who was Shirley's mother, was a deeply conventional woman who was disturbed that her daughter was not going to live a deeply conventional life, which Shirley did in some ways and did not in others, but we'll get to that after. When Shirley was a sophomore in high school, her dad got a job in Rochester, New York, and so the family moved there. Shirley started at the University of Rochester, and she failed out her sophomore year. Apparently depression had started to kick in. She wasn't happy. She took a year off and then moved to Syracuse University. And there she wrote for the school's literary journal. She had published a short story called Janice. And Janice was a brief tale about a young girl and her attempt at suicide. Now, another student at the school, Stanley Edgar Hyman, read the story and said, "I'm going to marry that woman." And in fact, he did. So Shirley Jackson and Stanley got married shortly after their graduation from college. Now, the marriage was problematic for both families. Let's start with the fact that Hyman was Jewish, which was a problem for Jackson's family, which I didn't get into the fact that Jackson's mother and grandmother were Christian scientists, and the grandmother claimed to be a Christian Scientist healer. And also Hyman was a communist, so the Jackson family wasn't thrilled with that. Shirley didn't even tell her parents they were married for months after. Anyway, they got married, they moved to New York. Shirley started writing. She published Red Book, Saturday Evening Post. Hyman was a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. Eventually, he was hired by the University of Bennington College in Vermont. So they moved off to North Bennington, where now Shirley was faced with living kind of a double life. One where she wrote some of her creepy tales, the other where she was a mother, ended up being a mother of 4 children. And while she's writing stories that are considered, like I said, horror, she's also writing these cute stories and silly stories about family life that were published again in women's magazines, and eventually those were all compiled in 2 books. What is it? Living with Demons, and there was another one, the title escapes me. So anyway, let's talk about Jackson's marriage. It wasn't good. Stanley believed that he just couldn't do monogamy, and he was actually it was against his principles to be monogamous. Now, other than a brief tryst, I think it was a kiss with someone once that Shirley had, it was all really the infidelity on Stanley's side. And it was generally with his students. Now, we're going to give him props because he didn't usually have affairs until they were no longer his students. But he was also controlling of Jackson. He controlled the finances in the household. Now, Jackson was bringing in bank for her stories. I think the lottery, she was bringing a few grand each story, and she ended up being the breadwinner for the family. However, Stanley controlled the finances. Also, it depends on who you're reading. Some will say that despite his faults, he was supportive of her as a writer. On the other hand, others have said that he was really jealous of her. And so he had created this kind of story that she was pretty much a gifted writer, but an idiot. And she would go into these trance-like states and come up with these stories, and then she'd have to go to Stanley, and he'd have to interpret the stories for her. And then once he did that, she was able to write them. So that's her marriage. Now, her makes sense when you look at that she would move into an abusive marriage because, as I said earlier, her mom didn't approve of her. But her mom was pretty brutal. Once her mother told her she was a product of a failed abortion, and she used to be highly critical of Jackson's writing itself, saying that it was repetitive and why did she have to, delve into such dark subject matter. So, poor Shirley had it coming from a few ends, the criticisms and those people that were diminishing of her and kind of chipping away at her confidence. So it's funny because to the outside world, Jackson, it is said, seemed pretty powerful. She could be a bit of I don't know if the word we want to say is a snob, but she looked down on the village people of North Bennington. She didn't much she found it diminishing to be a faculty wife. She didn't have a lot of patience for the schoolgirls running around. On the other hand, she was deeply troubled and suffering. She at one point developed agoraphobia. She was afraid of people. She felt like a misfit and an outsider. She drank heavily. She smoked heavily. She became extremely overweight. She abused amphetamines. And sadly, Jackson's body probably couldn't handle all of that because she died in 1965, and I believe she was 48 years old. Now, it's important to understand Jackson a bit to understand her stories and the themes that run through so many of her stories. First of all, you see houses a lot, and you're going to see it in the summer, people. You're going to see the beach house, but it plays a big role in that. I mean, it's what the story is essentially, not about, but it's a big setting of the story. Of course, you have it in Hill House. We have always lived in the castle. And what you find is the home that's supposed to be a place of safety and security. Either characters are imprisoning themselves within their own homes, taking Hill House with all its weird angles. It's probably Eleanor that's the one that is bringing the negative energy into the place and putting responsibility on the house itself. So we see that theme a lot. Interestingly, and not that it really matters, but Jackson came from a family of builders and architects. Her grandfather, her great-grandfather, apparently her great-grandfather, great-grandfather built some of the oldest homes in San Francisco. Also, when Jackson published The Haunting of Hill House, she used that money to pay off her mortgage for the house in North Bennington. And then when the movie rights were bought, she used it to remodel her house. So Jackson herself was a woman that felt, she wanted to be in the home to an extent, and she felt imprisoned by the home. So you see that theme of the house and being a prisoner within it for whatever the reason. You're going to see that in the summer people. Of course, you're always going to, not always, but in so many of our works, take for instance the Lottery, you see the, or not the Lottery, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, where someone feels like an outsider, they don't fit in. You have the violent villagers that are rejecting someone within the community. Again, you're going to see that in the summer people. And yeah, so let's get into the story. The Summer People is about a New York City couple who, for the past 17 years, with their children initially, vacationed in at a lake house in Vermont. And we find the couple, Mr. and Mrs. Allison. They are now, Mrs. Allison is 58 and Mr. Allison is 60. And they have decided they're going to do something very wild this summer. And they're going to remain at their beach house, their lake house, past Labor Day for another month or so. Because when they go back to New York City every year, creatures of habit, the day after Labor Day, they would always leave the summer house. They'd go to back home to New York City. And then they regret it, because as anybody who knows who lives in this area, it's hot in September. And so they decide that they're going to do something wild, and they're going to stay on at their lake house. Now, there's something funny about this story right out of the gate, and that is Jackson's, for me, I don't know if it troubles other people, and I'm curious if you would comment later, on Jackson's emphasis on Mr. and Mrs. Allison being elderly. Okay, we have Mrs. Allison, 58, Mr. Allison, 60, and I know, oh, people live longer now, but not necessarily. Let's think. If this story was published in 1950, the Allisons were born probably, in Jackson's mind as she's writing it, late 1800s, turn of the century. I'm thinking back on my great-grandmothers, and they lived well into their 90s. Now, I think it's a regional thing as well. These people are, the Allisons in the story, they're wealthy-ish. You understand that Mr. Allison had a desk job. It wasn't like he was working in the mines. We would assume that they had access to good health care. But right from the beginning of the story, Jackson's referring them to elderly, and she also says that they decide to stay on at this beach house because their friends have started to die. So, I don't know. I did a little research, and the average life expectancy in the United States in the 1940s and 50s was like 65 for men and 70-something for women. But then again, I attribute a lot of that to the outliers that are messing around with the averages. And we're not talking about the median, and we're not talking about the region of the country. So that's neither really here nor there. It kind of is an issue for me. But the Allisons decide to stay on. And it's the day after Labor Day. They go into town, and they proudly start to tell everybody, the townsfolk, that they're just going to stick around for another month. And the reaction to the townspeople is weird, and you get that they don't really, they're perplexed by this notion that they're going to stay. It starts with Mr. Babcock, who is the grocer, right? And Mrs. Allison's telling him he's staying on, and he's saying, no one ever stays on after Labor Day. No one ever stays on after Labor Day. And afterwards, you can kind of see where the Allisons don't fit into this community because, well, they're kind of shits. They're snobs in their own way, and they look down on the village people. And Mrs. Allison says something to her husband like, well, he looks like this Mr. Babcock, Daniel Webster, but it's all that inbreeding that kind of messes with the mind or whatever. So you've got this thing going on. You can see the villagers aren't thrilled already with the Allisons staying, but then you can kind of understand why. All right, so then they go to the hardware/clothing store/general store, which, by the way, those stores still exist around here in certain parts. And the man, Charlie Walpole, that owns that store already knows that they're staying on, which is weird because you wonder how quickly word travels. And he starts saying, nobody's ever stuck around here, nobody ever stays after Labor Day. That's the response of everybody. Now, keep in mind, she walks out of the store, she meets a Mr. Hale, who is their neighbor, sort of. They can see his house from their lake house, and he's the guy that delivers their eggs. And he also has the same reaction, like, nobody ever stays after Labor Day. All right, so the Allisons go back home. As they're driving home, Jackson notes that the road home is rough. It's kind of a rough ride home. I forgot to mention the first line in the story, Jackson informs the reader from the first sentence that the lake house is 7 miles from the nearest town. So you've got quite a distance from where their house is and where civilization is. Okay, now it's the next day, and Mrs. Allison is baking a pie, and let's see how these events start. First of all, she realizes she's running out of kerosene, which now their beach house is, there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no real plumbing. They use an outhouse. And this is how the Allisons like this house. They like it old-fashioned. They like it in the past. They haven't done any renovations on it, but they need this kerosene. So kerosene man drives by. Mrs. Allison stops him and informs him that she's going to need some more kerosene. They're staying on. And this guy basically says, yeah, no, can't do it. And she almost begs him, what are we going to, can you please? And he's like, yeah, no, sorry, I don't order enough and wasn't planning on you staying. Maybe Mr. Babcock, the grocer, will have some. So Mrs. Allison goes into her house and she calls Babcock the grocer. Now, she was just there the day before. And it's an old-fashioned phone. And she said that it seemed like the narrator says, it seems like Babcock didn't even expect the phone to ring in the store. And he says to her, because she called for him to deliver some extra groceries and, to see if she can get some kerosene from him. He's like, no, don't do deliveries anymore. Now, she was just in the store with her husband the day before. You'd think he would have told her that they weren't going to do deliveries anymore. And now we know that the road is difficult to get to town. So now she seems slightly concerned. You start to get just an odd sense here that this whole staying on at this summer house is not going to be so easy. So she tells her husband that the next day he better go down to town again, into the town, and get the supplies, the groceries, the kerosene. In the meantime, the husband Mr. Allison is complaining that they haven't been getting the mail. The mail isn't, they don't get mail for days, and then they get a bunch of mail, and then they don't get it for days. And they're waiting for letters from their children, because usually the children send them letters pretty regularly. They haven't gotten any. Mr. Allison is kind of, his knickers are in a twist over that. So that's going on. Next day, Mr. Allison goes to get into his car, and the car won't start. Now, he comes inside and they call the mechanic, and then nobody answers the mechanics. And Mrs. Allison says, or the narrator says, that Mrs. Allison is starting to feel nervous, and she doesn't really know why. I mean, she should know why. But, so anyway, they need this kerosene, though, and they can't get out with the car. And then, I'm trying to think of the chronology of what happens next. So Mrs. Allison goes to call the mechanic with this old-fashioned phone. Remember, they have to dial in. And nobody's answering. And the narrator says that Mrs. Allison is starting to feel nervous. She doesn't quite know why. Now, we can see this a mile away where it's going, but characters in the book aren't sure what's going on. It just seems like just shit luck. Anyway, she suggests that Mr. Allison go down to the mailbox and see if they have a letter. Mr. Allison walks the mile to the mailbox. As he's coming up, he's happy. He's holding a letter, but Mrs. Allison notices that he's having a hard time breathing. He's breathing heavily. And again, we're going to think that maybe Jackson's attributing this to his age of 60. So brings the letter in, and they read it. It's from their son. And as they're reading it, Mrs. Allison is not feeling comfortable with this letter. Something's not right. The letter, when they're done reading it, both she and her husband kind of look at each other, and Mrs. Allison says, something's not right. Now the issue is, she can't find a single phrase in that letter that doesn't sound like their son. But the letter doesn't sound like their son. And then the narrator points out that perhaps it was all the dirty fingerprints that were on the envelope. So, Mrs. Allison isn't feeling great. Mr. Allison isn't feeling great. Mrs. Allison says, okay, let's try that mechanic again. Mr. Allison goes, calls, phone is dead. Now, it seems like they can be in a bit of trouble, no? Also mentions that Mrs. Allison senses that there's a storm coming, the inside of the house is darkened, but everything looks fine when she looks outside. So some time passes, and it's later that day. The Allisons decide they have no more kerosene. They have no light. They're sitting outside, and the storm starts to roll in. They come into the house, and they're listening to the radio at this point, and they're listening to a New York channel. And I want to just read a couple of lines to you that struck me, because Jackson is known for her pretty clear and concise and streamlined writing. But it doesn't mean that she doesn't have these startlingly beautiful sentences that she weaves within her stories. And there's this one moment where the Allisons are listening to the radio. It's battery operated. We know that the batteries are kind of going on this radio. He spoke to them in the summer cottage, quite as though they still deserved to hear news of a world that no longer reached them except through the fallible batteries on the radio, which were already beginning to fade, almost as though they still belonged, however tenuously, to the rest of the world. Almost as if they still belong to the world. But what we have is we have the Allisons, that their communication from New York is no longer coming in very clearly, and it's echoing out and being pushed back by the landscape, by the Vermont landscape. And they're not supposed to be where they are. They don't really have a place in New York anymore. At one point, Mr. Allison reaches for her hand. They're sitting there in the dark, and she says, I wonder, is there something that we should do? And Mr. Allison says, let's just wait. Or no, there's nothing to do but just wait. And at the end, it's just this kind of a sad moment when the narrator says, the radio faded and sputtered. The two old people huddled together in their summer cottage and waited. And so the question I have is, it's a really terrifying story. It escalates, initially it makes a lot of sense. These people are staying, and then one thing happens and another. And then when you find out that the car is not working and the phone is dead, and they're in trouble. Now here's the question. Is this a story about people that just don't know their place? The Allisons don't belong. They're not villagers. They shouldn't have stayed. And if that's it, perhaps the villagers are just trying to get them out of there, and the next day someone will show up and help them. Is it more nefarious than that? Especially when you think about that letter and all the fingerprints on it. Is there something more evil at stake here, at work here? Or is this a story really about death and aging? So I'm curious what you think. Please leave some comments. Let me know. If you like this episode, like and subscribe. And also, my source material, I listed in the show notes. All literary analysis is my own, but when it comes to interviewing family members and the biographical information, that's come from a lot of great sources, and so I suggest you look at those and you read them yourself. And that's it for now. Take care. Bye.